Welcome, Collin County hobby beekeepers. I hope you're surviving well. Everyone is healthy and surviving this heat and the COVID and getting ready to harvest. If you haven't harvested your honey, hope that everyone gets a good honey crop. We'll see here in a few weeks. But other than everyone hang in there, stay safe. I'm just going to say we got Blake that's going to be doing the bee talk again, thankfully. And I think John is going to be talking about harvesting the honey tonight. If y'all have any questions, post your questions, and Blake or somebody will be answering them. So we will get the meeting started, and I will give it to you, Blake.
Okay, thank you, Russell. All right, well, I am trying to get it set up so that I can view any questions that you have as I'm presenting on a separate device over here. So hopefully I'll be able to answer your questions as I go through Bee Talk. Russell, how long do I have for Bee Talk tonight?
30 minutes will be good.
Okay, awesome. Great, well, I'm gonna jump in. I mean, there is so much to talk about this month, so I'm gonna jump right into the PowerPoint and I'm gonna kind of fly through it because there's a lot to present to you guys tonight with the heat, harvesting. I'm glad that is it Skip or John presenting tonight?
It's John.
John, okay. John, I'm really glad you're presenting on harvesting so I can leave that out of my Bee Talk completely, which will be very helpful. So, all right, let me go ahead and share my PowerPoint. Okay, there we go. All right, so watch those smokers in July. It's hot outside, so be really careful about setting your smokers down outside in this dry grass. So it can be an expensive lesson if you don't. This thankfully wasn't this year. This was a painful experience 2 years ago, I think. It was a friend of mine. He runs bees and he helps run my bees up in North Dakota. And he set his smoker down and went and grabbed lunch. And when he came back, this is what was left. So those smokers get hot. So watch where you set those things. So we're going to talk mostly today about winter preparation. And I don't know about you guys. I love looking at this picture on days like this where it's 100 degrees. It just feels cooling to look at this picture. but most people don't think about preparing your bees for winter until that first cold front blows in October. And you think, okay, well, I better make sure my bees have enough food. I better make sure that they have everything they need for winter. Winter preparation really starts the instant you harvest your honey. And so, most of you are in the middle of harvesting honey now. And so as soon as you pull those boxes of honey off your bees, that's when winter preparation begins. And so that's really what we're going to be talking about. And from now until winter gets here, we're going to be talking about what actions you need to take to make sure your hive is completely ready for winter. Because if you wait until October, November to prep your hive for winter, it's too late. There's not much really management-wise that you can actually do in those months. So we're going to mostly talk about what you should be doing and what you can be doing now. If you have questions as we go along, feel free to put them in the chat box. I think I can see it. And I'll try to answer those as I'm going along. And if I can't get to all of them, then we can do them at the end. So the honey flow is pretty much over. Unfortunately, these are some sad pictures. I hate taking these, but the far left is what's left of the Indian blanket. This middle there is a scabiosa. And so really our major nectar producing flowers have just about died off. There's still some pockets of bloom here and there. And I gotta say, the third, let's see what is today? The last week of June, I was pretty convinced the flow had completely wrapped up. And then we got some pretty significant rains there in the first week of June. And that kind of brought a little bit of a resurgence of kind of a final kick of honey flow. And so kind of that first week of July through the most of next week, I was actually seeing the bees bringing in some nectar. They were bringing in some pollen as well. And now with this heat, I mean, today it's 100 degrees and windy, and it's just drying everything up incredibly quickly. So, and there's no rain in the forecast for the foreseeable future. So flow's about over at this point. It did kind of, again, have that final kick right at the early July. And I had some hives bring in an extra 5 or 10 pounds in North Texas, but by and large, it's wrapped up at this point. We are seeing some summer blooms, though. I mean, we're seeing the sunflowers are blooming, crepe myrtles are blooming, sumac. That purple flower is the thistle. And I forgot to put a picture of it. I even took some pictures today just for tonight. Man, I forgot to put them up. But the snow on the mountain is close. It's getting close. I took some pictures in a field this morning when I was out working bees. And last week, the snow on the mountain was about a foot tall. And I thought, oh, that's a month away. And then a week later today, I mean, it was, some of those plants were getting ready to bloom. So I still think we're about a week away from the snow on the mountain blooming, but it's getting really close. So if you haven't harvested your honey, time to get it off before that snow on the mountain starts blooming. Sophie asked, is crepe myrtle, is it good for pollen and nectar? I don't know. You know, John, you've got that one right beside your honey house door. I know I always remember seeing bees working it, but I can't remember if they were getting pollen or nectar off of it.
It's only pollen, not nectar. It's not a very good nectar.
Yeah, just the pollen. So yeah, so it's a great pollen source, but not so much for the nectar. That's what kind of stinks about most of the summer blooming plants. There's not a lot of great nectar producers. The snow on the mountain actually does produce nectar a little bit. So, but most of these flowers are just pollen producers. Okay, so let's think for a moment about what do bees need to grow and to thrive. Okay, and this is so important as we go into the summer. They need protein, which is pollen or pollen substitute. They need a variety of pollen. So you don't just want one or two sources of pollen. Just because bees are bringing pollen in doesn't mean it's very good pollen nutritionally. And so this time of year, you know, right now the bees are bringing in a ton of white pollen and a little bit of other pale colors. But one thing you've got to watch is if bees are only bringing in one or two colors of pollen, that pollen source may not be very good nutritionally for the bees. The protein content could be low. The amino acids in it could be poor. And that's often what you see in the summer pollen flows is just because they're bringing it in doesn't mean it's providing the bees all the nutrition that they need. Bees also need carbs, which is nectar or syrup. They need to be largely mite-free, which is 2 mites per 100 or less. They need to be largely free of brood diseases, and they need to have a healthy and vibrant queen. So those are the elements that bees, any time of year really, need to grow. So if we want to see our hive thrive, stay healthy, and grow, those are the elements that have got to be in place. And so that's what we're going to focus on tonight is how do we achieve those elements in a Texas summer when it's hot and dry and everything starts to die. Tracy asked a question, and let me try to read it really quick. So basically, Tracy, you harvested your honey. You had a deep and 2 supers. You harvested 1 super and you left 1 super. And then you added a deep box and a top feeder to keep them busy and help them with the heat. Is that too tall going into winter? 1 deep with a brood box, 1 new deep, and a super with honey and a top feeder. And you're currently feeding pollen substitute and syrup. Good for you. You're doing the right thing. So as far as that being too tall going into winter, it's all a matter of what's in them. So if you've got 2 deeps and a medium and they're all full of honey and they're all full of bees, it's no problem. If you get to October and those 2 deep boxes are full of bees and honey and that top box, you know, doesn't have much of anything in it, maybe just a little bit of honey and no bees, you can go ahead and pull that off. So I would say just leave it for now, keep feeding like you're doing, and then wait until the fall gets here, and then let's reassess depending on how many bees are filling those supers. Certainly going to help them over the summertime though. So as we go into the summer, you know, we think about fat bees versus skinny bees. There's a really good book out there called Fat Bee, Skinny Bee. And we want our bees to be fat bees. The thing about bees is if they aren't getting the right pollens into the hive, and if they don't have enough nectar or syrup coming into the hive, the fat cells in a bee's body begin to shrink. And when that happens, their immune system is lowered, and they're not able to feed the developing baby bees a full rounded nutritional diet. Now, the danger with that is that this time of year, the summer, is when bees are raising baby bees that are going to need to try to start surviving the winter. And if the bees are starved nutritionally over the course of the summer, and they don't have enough nutritional pollen and they don't have enough syrup, then you'll frequently get bees that aren't able to survive the winter months. And that's when you often see that fall and winter dwindle as those bees are dying off prematurely. So it's really important that we maintain proper nutrition for our hives over the course of the summer. So this is a great comparison picture. I'm sure you can guess which is which, but the picture on the right is what I often see in the springtime. This is a picture I took this spring of pollen stores in a hive. You know, in the spring, you'll often see these frames just completely full of pollen, beautiful frames with pollen. This time of year, you tend to see a little more scattered pollen scattered throughout the brood, maybe a little bit on the edge, but not a whole lot of pollen. And so you really got to start watching the pollen stores inside your hive. And if you get to a point where you can't find a thick band of pollen around the brood, or you can't find a half a frame of pollen in the hive somewhere, there's a good chance that your hive is getting a little bit starved nutritionally, and it's time to step in with some pollen patties during the summer in order to make sure they continue rearing healthy brood. The same goes with syrup. You know, these are some signs of a well-fed hive. You know, on the picture on the right, you've got that nice thick band of honey or syrup around each frame of brood. Picture on the left, anytime you see the bees whitening the comb or adding burr comb that's white, that's fresh new wax, it's a good sign. It means the bees have an excess of food and they're starting to build comb. Always a really good sign. Another trick to watch for is well-fed larvae versus hungry larvae. Now, this is a tip that I heard from Randy Oliver several years ago, and I've used it ever since, and I found to be really true. If you look at the larva in your hive, ideally the newly hatched larva, so a larva that's 24 to 36 hours old in your hive, you should see what we see on the right-hand side there, just larvae that are floating in that white royal jelly. I mean, you can see these larvae have been fed plenty. The picture on the left, you see those larvae look almost dry. You can't hardly see that royal jelly underneath them. And that's a problem. That often means that they don't have the carbs and the protein that they need. And they've got to have both. They've got to have carbs and protein to properly feed those developing larvae. So go through your hive, look for that pollen, make sure you've got thick bands around the brood, or at least a half a frame of pollen or so on the outside of your brood nest. Look for those larvae floating in royal jelly. Make sure you've got multicolored pollen in your hive. If you're not seeing those things, it wouldn't hurt to give them a pollen patty and make sure that they've got plenty of syrup as well. One quick side note, I know it's hard to see these little larvae in the hive. And so one thing you can do is you can hold that frame so the sunlight is shining down directly into that frame. And then you can get your smartphone and video, a really slow video over, a couple inches above that frame, and then go back inside and you can watch that video, and then you can zoom up with your smartphone and see what those larvae look like. So this picture on both of these pictures, I just took 20 pictures over a frame inside the hive, and then I went inside and just zoomed up, and that's these pictures you can see here. So I want to, in the same vein of feeding, I want to talk about trickle feeding a little bit, because trickle feeding, Eileen asked before we switch topics there, she asked, how do you achieve the excess of royal jelly? So the excess of royal jelly, the bees will do that on their own if they have plenty of pollen and plenty of nectar or syrup. So if the bees are short on pollen, or if they're short on nectar, syrup, or honey, then they won't feed those larvae enough royal jelly. They're kind of starving. And so if you're not seeing that in your hive, it's this time of year especially, it's time to feed a pollen patty and then do some syrup feeding as well. And then they'll feed that excess royal jelly. So it's more about making sure you've provided the bees with enough pollen or pollen patty and syrup. So that leads perfectly into what I'm doing this time of year. which is trickle feeding. And I've been doing this really since mid-June. I've got several hundred hives that I kept here in North Texas this year, and we're just splitting them constantly. So I'm basically, I started with 150 hives. When did I start splitting those? So I took 150 hives in mid-June, and I'm working to turn those into about 800 hives by mid-August. And so I'm just splitting them nonstop through the summer. And to do that successfully, I've got to make those bees grow and thrive during the summer. And so it's really, the way I do that is by trickle feeding. And trickle feeding works really well, not only to grow hives during the summer, but just to sustain a hive. And because what you'll often see hives just kind of decline in strength over the summer because there's nothing for the bees to do. It's hot. There's no pollen coming in, not much nectar coming in. And so the trickle feeding really helps encourage that queen to keep laying through the course of the summer. It's really simple. Basically, it's giving about 2 1-pound pollen patties per month. And that's so about 15 days apart. A good strong hive should eat a pollen patty in about a week or so, a week to 10 days. You don't want to feed more pollen substitute than the bees can eat in about a week, because then you can have the small hive beetle larvae start laying eggs, and you can have small hive beetle larvae developing in that patty. So most strong hives, though, that are at least 1 deep box completely full of bees, they can go through a pollen patty in a week, no problem. So I'm feeding about 2 pollen patties a month. And I made a comment on one of our TBS Zoom webinars a while back that you can't feed dry pollen powder in the summer because there's still a little bit of pollen coming in, and the bees won't go out and forage on dry pollen powder unless there's no nectar flow whatsoever. So I'm usually an advocate of that in the dead of winter. And then the next day, a guy sent me a video or a picture of his bees a couple days ago foraging on dry pollen powder. So they will do it, and I'm going to try it later this week. But you can, apparently, I'm going to try it as well and see if it works. But you can do dry pollen feeding in the summer as well. Kind of shows you just how much of a pollen dearth we're in if they'll go out and forage on that dry mix. And then trickle feeding sugar syrup, it's feeding about 1/4 to 1/2 gallon of 1-to-1 sugar water per week. And that's if the honey was harvested out of your second box. So if you've got a deep box and then a medium box or another deep box that's completely full of honey, you wouldn't need to give them this much syrup. They don't really need it. I would still give them the pollen patty, but they don't really need that much syrup. If you've harvested all the honey out of your top boxes, then this trickle feeding works really well. Or if you add a third box, if your 2 boxes are currently completely full of bees and you want to add a third box, let's say to get them to draw it out over the course of the summer, then you could do the trickle feeding of syrup. And that works really well. Basically, it's tricking the queen into thinking there's a pollen and a nectar flow. And so she starts laying eggs and keeps working through the course of the summer. So that trickle feeding, again, it just kind of simulates a natural nectar flow and encourages the bees to keep growing. And what I've noticed is when I do this, I can maintain my hive strength through the summer. And so if I had 2 deeps full of bees and brood, if I do this trickle feeding, then by the end of the season, going into winter, there's still 2 deeps full of bees and brood. If I don't do that, I notice they really start declining in strength. Or if you want to do summer splits, then when I'm doing a summer split, I'm taking 4 frames of brood, and then I'm doing this with a new queen. I'm doing the trickle feeding, and after about 4 to 6 weeks, they're back up to 7 to 8 frames of brood by practicing trickle feeding. Real quick, what type of pollen substitute? I don't recommend homemade patties these days. Most homemade recipes are brewer's yeast and soy flour, things like that. They really don't have a lot of nutritional benefit for the bees. You can do dry feeding like we talked about. What I really recommend is the pre-made patties. They're super simple. Make sure if you buy pre-made patties that they're about the consistency of the thick peanut butter. You don't want them hard, you want them pretty soft. But they're really convenient. Most of the modern mixes, Ultra Bee is what I use and recommend. Most of the newer patties have the proper nutritional content for the bees. You can do, if you buy the powder and mix up your own pollen patties, that works great. Just remember the consistency needs to be about like peanut butter, and you've got to use corn syrup or high fructose corn syrup to mix that powder. If you use sugar water, then that patty will harden in the hive. And then pollen patty placement, it's real simple. You just put it right between your two boxes, and they're flat enough that they kind of squish down between those two boxes. No problem. Some common questions with pollen patty feeding is, what about small hive beetles? Because the small hive beetles do love pollen patties. I think it's one of their favorite desserts. Just make sure you don't feed more than they can eat in about a week, which again is about 1 pound, a 1 pound patty on a strong hive. They'll eat that in about a week. If you do get some small hive beetle larvae on that patty, you can pull it out of the hive, throw it in the freezer for a couple days to kill all those larvae, and put it back in the hive. How much pollen patty feeding is too much? You can't really overfeed pollen patties. You can overfeed syrup, which we'll talk about in a minute, but pollen patties, you can't really overfeed it. Should you feed if your bees are already bringing in pollen? So we did talk about that. If it's just kind of a 1 or 2 colors of pollen and that's it, then I would feed, even if my bees are bringing in some. Even if your hive is really strong, I would still feed, because that's going to help keep them strong. And pollen patties can be a bit of a debate, and some people go, my bees are bringing in pollen, I don't need to feed pollen patties over the summer, that's excessive. And you might be right. One thing I would encourage you to do is take one of your hives, or half of your hives, however many you have, feed 1/2 of your hives pollen substitute pollen patties through the summer, and the other half don't, and see which look best going into the winter months. Yeah, Skip says you've taken one side of the paper off of the pollen patty to encourage them to eat faster. And you can do that. If it's a strong hive, then they can they'll eat it a little faster that way. If it's a weaker hive, you got to be careful, because sometimes that patty will dry out without that paper on it. But yeah, especially if it's a strong hive, yeah, you're absolutely right. You can tear a little bit of that paper off. So options for putting your bees to work this summer. So if you don't want to just kind of maintain your hive, if you want to put them to work, if you're really an enthusiastic beekeeper or kind of want to go above and beyond, there are some options. And remember, bees do better if they're working. Just sitting around in the hot heat, in the heat all summer isn't really good for bees. So if I have bees that are in North Texas over the summer, most of my hives are up in North Dakota at this time of year, where it's the guys are complaining sometimes, because it hit 80 degrees today. That's hot up there. So, most of my bees go up there, but if I do, and sometimes I do keep bees in North Texas over the summer, I really want them busy, because they do so much better. And so one thing I do is I get them to draw out foundation for next year. And so you can put deeps or mediums of foundation on top of your hives, and you can do the trickle feeding like we talked about. So a thinner syrup, more like a 1-to-1 syrup. Really, and we talk about 1-to-1 versus 2-to-1 all the time. Really, somewhere between 1-to-1 and 2-to-1 is fine. You just don't want to go below 1-to-1 is the key, because then it ferments. But if you do that trickle feeding with a deep or medium of foundation on top of your hive, then the bees will draw it out over the course of the summer. And then you've got your comb drawn out for next year, and they don't have to draw it out on honey. You've got them to draw it out ahead of time. You can also do summer splits, and those work really well as well. And I'm sorry, I had an ad up there from a different Zoom call, and it's over, so ignore that. But you can also do summer splits, and those work well. And that's a whole other topic, a whole other program that maybe you can do. CCHBA can do a different time, but in essence, the summer splits, you take 4 frames of brood and a new mated queen, and make that split. And then you've got to do that trickle feeding through the course of the summer to get them back up to strength. But it works really well. So it's a great time of year to do summer splits. I don't recommend doing them after August 15th. That's kind of my cutoff date for doing summer splits, because after August 15th, like I said, it takes about 6 weeks for a hive to regain its full strength for summer splits if you started with 4 frames of brood. And so after August 15th, 6 weeks later, you're looking at the 1st of October, and it's just hard to get bees to grow in October. So you really need them to hit that peak strength by the 1st of October, which means that August 15th is essentially the latest that I want to be doing summer splits. Okay, Varroa. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. I don't even know how we're doing on time here. So somebody yell at me if I'm going nuts on the timing. But Varroa, all I can say is that it's definitely the leading cause of death for, I said small scale beekeepers here, but really all scale of beekeepers. I mean, Varroa is something you've just got to get under control. And those Varroa population levels tend to peak in July and August. So they're peaking now, and they don't outright kill your hives. And it's the leading cause, like I say here, of winter death. And so a lot of people say, well, I had plenty of bees in my hive all summer, and then it started getting cold in the fall, and then my bees died during the winter. Oftentimes that's because the Varroa population wasn't controlled back in the summer months. So it's so important to get those Varroa mite levels under control right now. I mean, if you haven't treated for mites, then I would encourage you to go do that this week, because if those high Varroa mite levels go on for too long in the hive, then your hive can pass a point of no return, because not only are Varroa hurting your developing bees, but they're also spreading viruses in your hive. And if those viruses reach too high of a level, then it can be really tough for your hive to overcome that virus load. And then a visual inspection is virtually pointless. So do not rely. I get so many people sometimes say, well, I looked and I didn't see any Varroa mites. And I say, well, you're probably not going to. I mean, if you're visually seeing Varroa mites in your hive's probably going to die. You shouldn't ever be visually seeing Varroa mites. Varroa mites live underneath capped brood that you can't see, and then they also live up underneath the abdomens of worker bees, where it's really hard to see. Oh, you've got Lance Wilson talking about splits or mites next month?
Mites.
Mites. Okay, great. So definitely tune into that. I would say though, don't wait till next month to hear what Lance has to say before you treat, because it's if you wait until mid-August to treat, it could be too late. So always do a test, and if your mite level is more than 2 per 100, then definitely go ahead and treat. This is a video on how to test for mites, but I'm guessing, Russell, I'm guessing it's about 3 minutes long. We're probably out of time, right?
You're good.
Okay. Well, let me try to stream this. If it doesn't, sometimes you never know how videos are going to do. So I'm going to start it, and I've got a different device. I'm going to watch it. If it's super choppy, then I'll just pause it.
Hey guys, Blake with Texas Bee Supply here. So today I want to show you guys how to do a mite test. Now this is probably one of the most important things to learn how to do and to practice regularly in all of beekeeping. Varroa mites will kill hives quicker than almost anything else. And the hard thing is, you really can't see them. There's no really good way other than doing a test to tell what your Varroa mite levels are. Now usually Varroa mite levels peak in the summer months, so usually late June, early July is when Varroa mite levels peak. And so that's the absolute most critical time of year to be doing testing and to be treating. I usually recommend testing 3 to 4 times every year, usually in March, usually in late June, early July, again after your treatment is done. So that's usually early August or so that your treatment's concluded, so you do a test to make sure your treatment worked, and then again in October-ish to make sure the levels didn't rise again. So doing a test is really critical. We've got this really easy Varroa Easy Check that we sell in the store. It makes it really, really simple. And we've already got our alcohol in here. And so you can see we've got a little bit of alcohol in the bottom, and we've got this little basket, and it actually has a little fill line inside that basket so you know how many bees to put in. It's usually about 1/2 of a scoop in this if you want to scoop them. But what I like to do is I like to get a sheet of newspaper or paper, and then I'm going to shake bees onto that piece of paper, fold it up, and dump them in the cup. So I'll show you guys that in a minute. But as far as where to get the bees from to do this test, you want them out of the brood nest area. And you want to, the most important thing is making sure the queen is not on the frame that you're going to get your bees off of to do this test. We're going to usually get about 300 or 400, about 300 bees is our goal. Now, thankfully, we don't have to count them. That's where that fill line comes in really handy on that test kit. But I'm going to pull a frame out of the brood nest, and I'm going to carefully look for the queen on this frame, make sure she isn't on here, because unfortunately when we do these tests, the bees do die, and we don't want our queen in there, obviously. So I don't see the queen on here. So what I'm going to do is we're going to come over here. We're going to take the lid off of our sample jar, get ready to dump bees in. And it's okay if this takes a couple of tries, but I'm going to shake the bees onto this piece of paper, and then I'm going to dump them into our sample cup. And you've got to move pretty fast because the bees fly. Now I didn't quite get enough in there, so I'm going to put the cap on, and I'm going to get another frame. Again, just check those frames, make sure the queen isn't on there. If your queen is marked, or if you've gotten pretty good at finding queens, then it's not a bad idea to find the queen elsewhere in the hive, just to make sure she's not on this frame. So, don't see her on here. So I'm going to shake these bees off. There we go. So I'm almost to my fill line, so I don't need too many more. There we go. That's enough. Now I'm going to put the lid back on. Now I'm just going to swirl this alcohol in there with the bees for about 60 seconds. And the idea is, what's happening is that alcohol washes all those varroa mites off of the bees into the liquid so that we can see the varroa mites. Like I said, the worst thing about this test is that it does kill the bees, and that's unfortunate, but it's one of the only safe and effective ways to actually get an accurate test. There are other testing methods out there. A common one is we call it the powdered sugar method, where you do something very similar but with powdered sugar, and it doesn't kill the bees. The problem with that test is that it doesn't actually work very well all the time. It can give you a rough indicator of your varroa mite levels, but this gives you a very, very accurate test. So typically speaking, if I see more than 2 or 3 varroa mites in this test, then I want to treat. If I see 1 to 2, then I usually will hold off another 3 or 4 weeks and test again. But usually if I see more than 2 or 3, then I want to do a test. In a lot of the literature, it talks about 7 is the threshold. That's pretty outdated. You know, really more than 2 or 3, and I want to get a treatment on the hive. Okay, so we've got that alcohol flushed over all these bees, and so now what we're going to do is, it's as simple as holding this jar up, and you can look from the bottom and count your mites, and they're actually surprisingly easy to see. And so I'm going to hold that up, and hopefully you can see in the video, but it's actually clear as day. You can just see those little brown mites floating on the bottom of that jar. And it looks like we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Looks like we've got six varroa mites. And so based on that, I'm going to go ahead and treat this hive. So that's how you do a mite test. If you want to see how to treat a hive.
Okay, so there we go. So that's, you know, in essence, how to do a mite test. And full disclosure, I was supposed to have like twice the amount of alcohol in there that I did. I ran out of alcohol right before we filmed that video. So that's why I was shaking for so long and stalling while talking my head off while I was trying to shake and get as many mites off as I could. But you're supposed to have about twice as much alcohol as I had in that video. And there were 6 mites. I think if I'd had more alcohol, I would have gotten more than 6, but 6 mites with 300 bees, you're looking at 2 mites per 100. And so I did want to go ahead and treat that hive. I think with, again, more alcohol, I think I probably would have gotten more like 10 mites. But that's how you do a mite test. It's pretty quick, pretty easy. I know people say, well, I don't want to kill 300 bees, but a good strong hive is going to have about 50,000 bees in it. So they really don't miss 300. And it's well worth doing to make sure that you've got your mites under control. So chemical controls, this time of year, you're pretty limited. I mean, with this kind of heat, you're really limited to Apivar, which is the amitraz-based strip that you see on the far left side of the screen there. The Apiguard in the middle there, the thymol-based treatment, you can't use that this time of year because it fumigates, and it fumigates really way too fast if it's over 80 degrees. So oxalic acid can work, but it's kind of iffy when there's this much brood in the hive because oxalic acid vapor doesn't get underneath the cells where a lot of the mites are underneath the cap brood. So you've got to treat at least 3 times, once every 7 days, at least for 3 weeks. The Apivar, again, is the most effective treatment, but always test before any treatment and always test after any treatment to make sure you actually killed the mites. One other real quick note is just on bearding. It's a common question this time of year. I would say the picture on the far left is what we call washboarding. It's where there's kind of a thin, even layer of bees on the front of the hive and they look like they're scrubbing almost. That's fine, no big deal. We're not even sure why bees do it. The middle picture is more common to what I see this time of year, where it's just the bees are they're not in one tight cluster. They're kind of all over the outside of the hive. They're just hot. And you often see this in the evening when all the foragers are returning. It's not necessarily a problem. If I see this on my hives, though, I usually try to get some shade over them. Under trees is best, but if you don't want to move your hive under trees, a beach umbrella works great. Something to give them some temporary shade. And then I always make sure that my boxes aren't totally packed full of bees. If all my boxes on the hive are more than 80% full of bees, then I go ahead and add another box just to make sure they've got room to stay cool inside that hive. The picture on the far right is more of what I see when a hive is getting ready to swarm. And I usually just see this in the springtime, not the summer. And you've got a really tight, compact ball of bees hanging out on the front of the hive. So cooling hives, I can just give you my best tips. A screen bottom board helps. Cracking that lid helps. Putting an empty box between the cover and your top box helps. Nothing helps as well as shade. I was hoping to have time. I know I'm running over, so I probably don't have time, but I actually filmed a video this morning while I was out working bees. I took 4 different thermometer probes and I put them in 4 different hives in the middle of the brood nest. This was when it was about 98 degrees this morning. And they all had screen bottom boards. 2 of them had 2 mediums, 1 had a deep, and then 1 was just a single. And none of them had entrance reducers. And it was interesting, the difference. I mean, basically the double deep hive was the coolest. They were about 99 degrees. And then the story and a half hives are both about 100 to 101. And then that poor single was like, it got up to almost 107 inside that single without it having any upper boxes. And then just for fun, I covered the screen bottom board on 2 of the hives and put an entrance reducer in them to see what would happen. And it raised the temperature in one of the hives about 1.5 degrees by sealing it up a little bit. They still could come and go from the entrance, but it raised it about 1.5 degrees. And then I put shade over one hive and it dropped the temperature inside the hive about 1.5 degrees. It dropped it almost, within 15 minutes. And then one of the hives that I sealed the bottom board and put an entrance reducer in actually got a little bit cooler. And what was really interesting is the hives that I sealed up a little bit, you could tell immediately the hive's focus went to cooling the hive. I mean, before I put them on, there were bees fanning in the entrance. But after I put those entrance reducers on and covered that screen bottom board, I mean, you could just hear the whole hive roaring. Whereas that hive in the shade, they were barely even fanning at all. So the conclusion I came to after that video was that a strong hive can keep themselves cool almost in any conditions, but it's going to take a lot of their effort and time and energy to keep the hive cool if you don't have a screen bottom board, if they're not in the shade, and if they have an entrance reducer on. If they're in the shade, have a screen bottom board, and have upper boxes and no entrance reducer, they can focus on things like rearing brood and gathering pollen. They don't have to spend so much energy keeping the hive cool. And then finally, that poor single hive, boy, don't have single story hives this time of year, unless they're in full shade, then I think they're fine. But, single story hives out in the full sun, they just cook. So if Mike or Russell, if you guys remind me, I don't mind, I can send you guys a link to that video if you want to email it out to the club at some point, that'd be fine. But it's an interesting, science experiment. Okay, kind of wrapping it up here. Don't forget to preserve your empty supers. So, your bees went to a lot of time and effort to raise or build all that comb. So now that you've harvested honey, make sure those empty supers, after you've put them back on your hive for 24 hours for the bees to clean up and pull them back off, make sure that you've got them in wax moth crystals so that the wax moths don't get in there. Oh, you're talking about that tonight too. Great. I'll skip it. There you go. I'm going to skip over wax moths. I think this is the final slide, but just water sources. Make sure you've got a water source for your bees. A lot of those ponds and creeks are drying up at this point. So within a quarter mile or so, make sure that there's a pond that doesn't dry up, or provide your bees with a water source. One quick side note, make sure your water source is in the shade. If it's in the full sun, the bees are often not going to drink it because it's just too hot. You can have, 120-degree water out there. So make sure your water source is in the shade. One real quick resource, if you go to our Texas Bee Supply website or the YouTube channel, pretty much every single thing I've talked about tonight, we've got a video for. And so if you want to view all those videos, you can view all those videos on there. So, okay, that is the end of the slideshow. Let me jump back. And if you guys have questions, feel free to ask them at this point or not, Russell, depending on how we're doing with time.
Yeah, go ahead if you got a few questions.
All right. So I guess if somebody has a question, feel free to put them in the chat box, or maybe unmute yourself, or at least put them in the chat box and I can answer them for you guys. I'm trying to see if I missed any up there. Can you treat with Apivar while feeding pollen patties? You can, yes. So what I try to do if I'm treating with Apivar and feeding pollen patties, then I try just to make sure the pollen patty isn't in direct contact with that Apivar. So I put my Apivar strips in, and then I just position the patty so that it's not touching those strips, and it tends to work just fine. So yeah, not a big deal. Okay, I'm guessing that is all the questions. I hate to cut anybody off, but I don't see any more. Russell, do you see any more?
I don't see any more. Well,
Oh, there we go. Oh, good question. I know a large-scale operation couldn't, but could a hobby beekeeper use the powdered sugar method for treatment? So yeah, it's a common consideration because the theory is if you have a screen bottom board, that you can dust your hive with powdered sugar. You can put about a cup of powdered sugar on your top bars, brush it between all your frames, and that powdered sugar coats the bees, and the varroa mites have a hard time hanging on to the adult bees with the powdered sugar on them. And so the varroa mite falls off the bees through the screen bottom board and dies. So there's been a lot of studies done on this actually, because it kind of became a big kind of treatment option. And the studies I've seen indicate it is not very effective. It helps. It knocks off a percentage of the mites. The only study I can think where it sort of worked, and it didn't get the mites down to a level where they should be, but it was able to keep the mites from growing beyond whatever levels they started at. And I think they were doing powdered sugar drench like 3 times a week. and that kept the varroa mites kind of in a, you know, if they started at 3 mites per 100, it kept them at 3 mites per 100, but it didn't get it below whatever that starting point was. So what I tell everybody is do an experiment, you know, try it, do a mite test, see what your starting numbers are, do that powdered sugar a couple times a week for 2 or 3 weeks, do another mite test, see what happens. In general, though, I haven't seen it be terribly successful, unfortunately. So someone else asked, have you seen fly examples of the fly that uses the bees as a host and lays eggs in the bee? Yeah, I'm forgetting. Oh, it's called the zombie fly. Yeah, that was all over the news a few years back. So it's a fly that, yeah, lands on the bees, lays an egg inside the bee, and the bee kind of goes crazy. I think the developing larva inside the bee attacks their nervous system, and it kind of makes the bees like zombie bees. So as if coronavirus and murder hornets weren't enough this year, we've got the zombie bees. But fortunately, I haven't heard a thing about that since it was all over the news a couple years ago. Usually if it's all over the news, then it's a lot of hype and nothing else when it comes to bees. So I think it's around, but it's certainly not causing any issues. And I haven't heard anything in a couple of years about it, which in the bee community usually means it's a non-issue. So that's good. Now the murder hornet or the Asian hornet, that'll be an issue once it gets here, but it's not here yet. Hopefully we have a few years still. All right, any other questions?
I think we need to go ahead and move on.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Russell.
I appreciate it.
Anytime.
Okay. All right. We'll move on to the next portion of the meeting with John Talbert. Are you ready?
We're ready.
Okay, we'll take it away.
All right. Good evening, everybody. We get the screen all set up here. This is a very important time of the year. You know, you've worked 11 and a half months to this point. If you're a year-round beekeeper, I mean, you've had bees more than 1 year. This is the time when you get the cake, or you hope you do anyway. But you've had a good crop of bees all spring long, and you've had deep forage farm out there, and they've made a crop for you. You have 1 or 2 supers on each box, and you're ready to do your honey harvest. Now, Blake and I remember when it was real easy to make a 60 to 100 pounds of honey on a beehive. It's much more difficult now, and you want to make sure that when you harvest, you do take good care of that crop and keep it in good condition, keep your supers and all in good condition afterwards, so that you're all ready to go next year. But what we want to talk about today on honey harvest is that this time of year, like Blake was talking about, the end of June, 1st of July, early August, you want to see about getting that crop off your boxes and ready to put in the jar. Now, so far this year, we've not seen near as many people ready to harvest. We're starting to get good numbers signing up here to use our facility, but in years past, I've had people lined up want to harvest in May, but not this year. We had our first ones about the end of June, and we're starting to get a good crowd lined up now. But the steps of harvesting your honey is you're all ready. You want to remove your supers, take them to the honey house, extract that honey, then let it set, bottle your honey, and storing your supers. Those are all important parts of getting from the honey on the hive, the honey stored, and your equipment ready to go for next year. So in preparation, in doing it, you want to go out to make sure that you know what you got out there in the bee yard, and we recommend that You do it the night before or the morning of the day that you're going to harvest your honey, to actually extract the honey. So you don't want to do it too soon. Several years ago, I had a beekeeper call me up in end of May, wanted to harvest, wanted to extract his honey. And I said, well, we're not ready to go yet. So he said, well, okay. And about 3 weeks later, he called back and he said, are you still ready? And I said, yes, come on out. Well, he called me later on that day and he says, I don't have anything. So we got to discussing it. And what had happened, he had pulled his honey off of his hives that day that he had first called, and he just set them aside in the garage on top of well, the bottom of the boxes were covered and the top was covered. And so when we said honey house was open, he went to bring them, and the hive beetles and wax moths had destroyed just about all the honey that was in there. He had left them in an unprotected state. So we certainly recommend you don't pull your box very soon before you're ready to actually extract, because an empty or unprotected box of honey is an open feeding ground for wax moth and hive beetle. They recognize that there's nobody there to protect it. One of the best ways to protect your honey against those two vermin is to have a strong colony. So don't harvest it too quick. But you go to the bee yard, and there's about 3 different ways that we recognize as being able to get the honey off of the boxes, and that is to go and remove every single frame one at a time, and with a bee brush, brush the bees off, put them over into another box and cover them. Once there's no bees on that frame, pick the other frame up, clean it, put it in there. So you go through the entire box or the entire colony in the honey storage area. You can shake them and brush them off that way. Or you can use a fume board. We like to use a fume board because it's much quicker and it seems to be very, very effective. You can buy those fume boards at the bee supply houses. I know Blake has them up at Texas Bee Supply. And they are essentially a 2-inch section of a hive body, really. And it has a piece of sheet metal on one side and a piece of felt under that sheet metal. You turn that upside down and you sprinkle a little bit of a chemical product. You go Bee Gone, Honey Bee Gone. There's several different brands out there. We like Bee Go. It's very, very effective. Sprinkle a little on there. Now, I want to warn you, don't use too much. Just a light sprinkling is all you need on that fume board. And when you go to the hive, raise the lid, put 2 or 3 puffs of smoke on it, then set that fume board on an angle so that the 4 corners are exposed and the bees that are in there can escape out the top before you set the fume board on completely square. But if you put too much fume Bee Go on that fume board and you set it down directly, sometimes you'll stupefy the bees and they won't move. They'll just sit there. They're frozen, like they're frozen. And you wonder, why in the world can't I get the bees out of this colony? So give them a little opportunity to whiff out first, and then you can straighten up the board and cover it completely. The way to know that it's very effective is that in about a minute or 2, the bees will just be spilling out of the front door, right through that entrance, just almost like a wave. By like we used to say about the lemmings going to the sea. But it's just a waterfall of bees coming out. You know that the amount of fumes, bee goes that you put on the fume board is correct. You haven't overdone it, and it's pushing the bees down. It doesn't harm the bees, but it does make them flee from it. You don't like it either. They don't like it either. So they will remove themselves out of that area. If you come back in about 5 minutes, and you take that fume board off, and you look down in there, and there's lots of bees still there, you can almost guarantee that you have some brood in that box. The nurse bees have to really be pushed to get off of brood, even under a fume board. So hopefully you have kept the queen out of your honey supers and you don't have that problem. But if you look down through there and the bees are not moving in between the frames, pull that frame up and you'll probably see some brood on it. So you'll have to brush them off. There's another one we didn't list here. Some people have used blowers to blow them off. I've never liked that, and I don't really recommend it because all you're doing is really disturbing the bees, and you don't need to have them disturbed while you're trying to harvest the honey. If you start having lots of bees around you and they're not very calm, you're probably past the end of the honey flow or nectar flow, and they become a little more defensive and not want to leave it. But if you harvest before the nectar flow ends, the bees will be real calm. You won't have much trouble them wanting to rob or anything like that. So once you've got those bees off of those frames, try to keep them in that super. We've had occasions where people took them out of the super, put them in Rubbermaid totes, and brought them to the honey house to extract. Well, that is not a good way to do it because those frames are setting loose there and they will rub along each other and you'll start dripping honey down in the bottom of your totes. If you want to use a tote to carry them in, get one that's big enough so that you can set the entire super in it. The super is the most effective way to transport frames. The frames hang straight and they don't rub against each other, and you lose very little honey that way. Once you pull that honey off of that hive and you're waiting to figure out where you're going to bring it the next morning or later on that day, don't go stick it in the air conditioner. Keep it in a warm situation. Honey flows out of the frame a lot better if it's warm. I've had people who harvested their honey a couple of weeks before they wanted to actually extract it in the freezer, froze it, and they didn't give it adequate time to fully defrost before they brought it out here. Cold honey just does not want to come out of those cells. So keep it in ambient conditions. We recommend that if you harvest your honey or pull your super off, and you can get a piece of plywood under it, or get another lid, a telescope lid or migratory lid that's made just the same size as that box. Set it right in top of that and get another lid and put on top of it. Those two will seal it off pretty good, keep the bees out of it, and make it easy to transport. So once you, if you're going to the honey house with them or whatever, put them in the back of your pickup or store them on cardboard or something like that in a van or SUV, whatever you're carrying them in. And just be careful with them. Don't let them bounce around or anything like that. So be real careful with that transporting your supers, because that's what you work so hard for. Don't waste that honey. In going to an extracting facility, what you'll need, well, of course, you're gonna need your supers. You're going to have a container. We recommend that you, once you extract, you put your honey in a 5-gallon bucket. It's a nice, easy, convenient way to store the honey. Unless you've got 15 or 20 hives, a Ziploc gallon bag will be enough to hold your cappings in. And of course, you got to have an uncapping knife to uncap with. You'll need a scratcher or a roller. And the extractor. Some of you will buy a 2-frame extractor that's hand powered, or a 4-frame, something like that, or you may be able to go ahead and get a 12-frame motorized. Each one of those is going to be a substantial investment on your part for probably using it once a year for 3 or 4 hours. So think about that. Extractors can be expensive. A 20-frame motorized extractor is going to run you close to $2,000. You're going to need some uncapping tubs. That's where you set the frame of honey up, and I'll show you a picture there. And you uncap over that. The cappings fall down in it, and that you don't lose it. And then you'll have to have a strainer for when the honey comes out of the extractor going into your bucket. Once you get to where you're going to extract, you can do 2 or 3 ways. You can uncap it with a knife. We recommend a hot knife. When I first started, we used a long bread knife, and that was 35 years ago. I still got that knife, but I don't use it for uncapping anymore. You can use a capping scratcher, and or you can use one of those capping rollers. I've used that a little bit. One of the things I don't like about it is that it doesn't take long for a lot of those caps to collect on that roller. Then you've got to stop and try to get them all off that roller so you can still use it to penetrate the capping. And another thing about both a scratcher and a roller is that you create a lot of small flakes of wax that when they go through the system, they fall out into the strainer, and they sort of stop up the strainer. So I'm a big fan of uncapping with a hot knife. So you'll place it in the extractor after you've uncapped it, and the smaller ones don't have a program in it. You'll manually vary the speed, starting off slow and moving up to 100% rate on that motor. If you're using a hand operated, rule of thumb that I always use is start off spinning it slow and spin it at least 25 times as fast as you can. 25 loops of the hand crank there. And that's one thing made me want to buy a motorized one, because when David Earl and I first started with 2 hives, it wasn't too bad. But on the 3rd year, we had 6 hives, and that was one of those great years. We had 3 boxes on each hive, and we were still doing 10 frames in each box. So we had, with 6 colonies, we had 18 boxes of honey, or 180 frames, and we were using a 2-frame extractor. It was a nice long day. We started at 9 o'clock in the morning and we finished 2 o'clock the next morning. And we both could hardly use our arms for the next 2 days because we just about wore them out. But anyway, I certainly recommend that if you're going to go and buy one for yourself, get one with a motor on it. You'll enjoy it a lot more. Take those frames out of the extractor, put them back into your box when you get through, and start straining your honey. What we see here is using a hot knife And notice the white tub I have down here on the bottom. And we've got a board across there that has a nail in it that we can set that frame on and makes it very easy to control. We angle the frame back at about 30 degrees. That picture doesn't quite get 30 degrees. Then I start at the top with my hot knife, and I hold the hot knife about 30 degrees off of the frame. There's a reason for the 30 degrees on both of those. If you hold it back a little bit and not completely vertical, you gravity will help you hold that knife on that board. And if you're holding it very straight up and down, you're having to force the knife against the board. But if you hold it at that slight angle, gravity will help hold it on the board. Then holding the knife at 30 degrees from the board lets you take advantage of the fact that that knife has a beveled edge to it. If you hold it flat against the bottom and top board, it will want to float up and get away from your caps and won't do uncapping. So you use a slight angle there and it makes it roll good. Notice in the second picture over here on the right, we have a roll of cappings as we work our way down. With a knife, we have very little cappings there that we're going to have to touch up with the scratcher. And people, after your first year, when you've got comb drawn in your frame, go to 9 frames. When you go to 9 frames, it allows you to, or allows the bees to make deeper cells, and they stick out further from the top bar and the bottom bar. And it allows you to be much more effective with your knife, so you don't have to do hardly any scratching. You roll it right down and it falls down into the tub, and you recover all those cappings and all that honey. You say, well, the bees have to build more comb. That's true, but it does allow you to be much more effective and much quicker in your uncapping process. And you're going to recover that honey and that wax anyway, because it's caught down in the tub. But it's a lot of fun to use that knife back and forth. What we do is like a sawing motion, and work our way down, roll that cappings roll right there and drop it. And that's part of the rewards of how much work you put into working those bees in the winter and the spring and all like that. Yeah, another part of the reward is the honey, but if you weren't doing this for the actual pleasure of beekeeping, it could be a lot of work. We set in this photo, we've set the frames in the extractor. This is a 20 framer you see there. We put the top bar to the outside, and we have actual holders there for the frames so that you don't slide around. And some of the larger extractors, the 60s and the 84s, they won't put those in there, and the beekeeper just stacks the frames in there as tight as he can. I like the ones with the holders because it allows the honey frames to be much more stable, and I think you empty the frame much quicker. Over in the right-hand picture is something we always do when somebody extracts. We say, get a picture tasting that first drop of honey that comes out of that extractor. That can be a lot of fun because you know that's going to be the best honey you ever tasted. It's your honey. But all right, that's one of our scholarship students a number of years ago. What you see here in the picture on the right is the gate on the extractor open, honey coming out. You see that's a very light amber honey coming and falling into the double seal strainer. What we do in ours is we have a 5-gallon bucket there. We use a a 5-gallon paint strainer bag that you can buy at the big box Home Depot or Lowe's and put it in there. And then we put our double sieve strainer on top of that. We also will put a piece of another bucket with the bottom cut off of it on top of that, so the strainer sets up higher than the 5-gallon bucket. You do have to watch what you're doing to make sure that you don't overfill it, though. The picture on the right is where we're holding the paint strainer bag to get the final straining of the honey as it's stored in the bucket. Lift that up over the bucket very carefully, let it drain through it, and then cup your finger around the top of the bag and strip it all out. So that's basically the harvesting activities from getting off of the box and into the honey house and into the 5-gallon bucket. Now, bottling your honey, we also recommend that you wait a couple of days after you put it in that 5-gallon bucket before you get ready to bottle, because you will have a good bit of entrained air in that honey. Let all of that air rise to the top, so it'll be a much more beautiful honey once you get it in the bottle. On storing it, people ask a lot of times, where do I store this 5-gallon bucket of honey? The only place I recommend that you not store it is in a refrigerator or something really cold. Store it in a pantry. You can actually leave it on the shelf in the garage. Honey is very forgiving on the storage and all. Don't leave it out in the real cold weather unless you want to rewarm it later on. But storage is not a big issue. Bottles. We recommend that you use good quality containers. Don't say, well, I'll just put that in a 2-liter Dr. Pepper bottle jug. That's not a very good way to do it. Put it in a glass jar or go and purchase some good plastic honey containers. Some people will want to put their honey in tanks. That's okay if you want to do that. We like to store ours and sell ours in a standard honey jar, something that shows off the honey as being a unique product and that sort of thing. Labeling. If you're going to sell some of your honey, there are very strict requirements on the labeling. You have to have the weight in both in metric and English numbers, pounds and ounces and grams, and those have to be on there. You have to have your name and your address on there, or something that identifies who put that honey together. No, if you're going to put it on the shelf in a store, you need to be selling it under a food manufacturer's license that you have to get from the Texas Department of Health and Human Services. There's a process you go through to do that. You will have to have a licensed kitchen or inspected facility. Now, if you're out in the country and you're on a well, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to get that kind of license, because they'll require you to have a monthly test on your water system. So if you're going to try to sell honey commercially, make sure that you get hooked up with some type of commercial kitchen, or you build your own with a certified water supply. Now, just for the general hobbyist, you can get by with, if you want to sell it yourself or give it away, you can label your honey. You still have to have your name on it and the weights and that sort of thing. But you have to have a disclaimer on there that says not processed in a facility inspected by the Texas Department of Health and Human Services. When you do that, you can sell a product to an individual if it's you or a family member and you make direct contact with that consumer. By using that disclaimer, you cannot set it on the shelf in anybody's store and sell it that way. You have to do it by their rules. It lets you fit under the college law. So that's one way to do it. You do need that disclaimer on there. The Texas Beekeepers Association sells those labels and tags like that you can get. So do it correctly. Don't get in trouble with somebody won't make trouble. Once you've done all this, well, think about putting in the contest. We hope to have a contest this year. We're not sure exactly how we're going to do it in the Collin County Association. We're now trying to figure out what we're going to do at the State Fair of Texas Hunting Contest. As you know, last week they canceled the State Fair, but I've been told that Creative Arts, where we hold our contest, is working on still being able to have their usual set of contests where people bring their entry down to the fair, is put in place, and they'll judge them and make the announcements of who the winners were. You just won't have the crowds of people going by and look at it. But we're still working on what that kind of contest will be. I'm sure that TBA is doing the same thing, trying to figure out how we're going to do it. We're hoping that TBA will still be able to meet in November. Seems like more and more things are getting canceled. Like we thought, well, our current thinking is we're going to get back for regular meetings in September, but I think you ought to be on standby for the latest information on that as soon as it comes out. We may or we may not. So this COVID-19 is creating lots of changes in everything we do. One of the things that I've noticed, though, is that people seem to be going to honey more. We're seeing honey sales moving up. You probably have had people say, well, if you're going to have honey this year, I'd like to have some of it. Those are the main things about the contest. So now we've got the honey taken care of. Let's talk about your supers. What you're going to do after you extract. How are you going to store your super and repair and prep for next year? We recommend that once you've extracted the honey out of the frames, that you go put them back on the hive for a couple of days. Let those bees go out there and really clean it out and get it good and dry. And then, depending on the size of your colony, what you're going to do. Blake was talking about if you only have a single deep and you've been using medium supers, that you could leave that super on there and let them fill that for winter. I'm a big fan of going into the winter with double deeps, whereby you would, once you clean that super out, you pull it off, you set a new deep on top of your single, and you start following the process Blake was talking about on getting them to build comb in there and use that second deep as your winter supply of honey. Keep those bees busy during the summer. Busy bees are happy bees. Happy bees are healthy bees. Make sure that you treat, you test and treat as needed, and keep them busy. The pollen patties, feed them the sugar syrup. Go. Now those supers that you pulled off to store them. The general way to store them, generally accepted way for quite a few years now, has been to put them in a bag or put them in a stack where they're sealed up and store them with an amount of moss crystals. There's several ways you can put those moss crystals in there. One is you can put a handful of moth crystals in a sock, tie the end up and throw it in the stack. And leave that in there and check it every 6 weeks to make sure you still have some crystals that haven't evaporated on you. One way that we did for years was we would take a empty frame, had no foundation in it, make a trough out of window screen down the bottom, about 2-inch high trough in the bottom of that frame, and then just about fill that frame with moth crystals, or that 2 inches of screen wire there. In the center of a 10 frame box, take out one of the frames and put this frame right in the middle of it, and stack your supers up so that that box right there would be number 5 in the stack. If you've got a lot of supers, you could go 10 in the stack and put one at 5 and one at box number 10. That's one way to store them. You can wrap them in plastic and seal the bottom and the top, and just put that sock of crystals up in the top and cover them that way. You could, before you did that, you could actually put them in a deep freeze and for a couple of days, and that would kill any wax moth larvae or hive beetle larvae that were in there. But you want to make sure that at least 24 hours at 0 degrees to kill those and kill the eggs before you do it. Then you can go ahead and store them like that. They can be stored in your garage or workshop or something like that, but make sure they're all sealed up and they're not set in a place so that mice could chew their way in or something like that. But make sure that you protect that comb you worked so hard for. That comb is a tremendous asset, and the more you have next year, the better off you're going to be and the more honey you're going to produce. The repair and prep for the next year item here. If you've got some damaged frames, you need to repair those things before you store them. If you've got boxes that need to be painted, think about painting them in the fall. Get everything ready so that you're primed for next spring. But prep for the next year. Or you could do what Blake was talking about and start growing your bees while they're making that new comb in that second deep. So it's a lot of good things you can do. Okay. So that pretty much wraps up what I have to say. We'll take some questions if you want to, or whatever.
All right, so
Did you see the chat questions?
yeah, what about skateboards?
The question there is about an escape board where it's the inner cover has a hole in the top of it, and you can buy those little escape things and put in there and raise up your honey super, put that inner cover under it so that it allows the bees to go out and they can't come back in. That's a way to do it. It's a very slow way, and there's no guarantee that you'll get all the bees out. So I haven't used it, but just a few times, and back when I was a hobbyist, and I said, there's got to be an easier way, and so I don't use it at all.
So from Sophie says, when you strain honey, is that considered filtered honey?
Well, we call that strained honey, not filtered. I consider honey, the term filter, to mean that you put it through a fine filter that gets just about everything out. And we call it strained. It's unfiltered. And we use that gallon or 5-gallon paint strainer, just like people used to use cheesecloth. you don't really trap any of the pollens or anything that you wanted. You do get the extra flakes of honey out, the bee's knees. Sometimes there'll be some bee heads in there too, but you get the things out that keep your honey from looking pretty. I don't consider strained honey to be filtered honey.
Says from May, can you please repeat the disclaimer we need on our labels for personal sale of honey?
Okay, the disclaimer is not processed in a facility inspected by the Texas Department of Health and Human Services. And I believe those are available at Texas Beekeeper Association. Blake may even
I
have
think
them.
Texas Bee Supply has them too.
Texas Bee Supply may have them too.
From Michelle Prescott, how many ounces of honey would be required for the contest?
The contest, I believe everybody's rule says a 16-ounce jar of honey, and it needs to be in, I think all of them are set up for queen line jars.
And it looks like Gene posted a example of the Texas Beekeepers, the exemption labels.
Okay,
So
right there.
there's the website there if you look in the chat box. That's texasbeekeepers.org /shop/exemption-labels /. So you can go in there and look for it on their website.
And there, some of these health departments can be very, very strict on that. I think Russell can tell you some experiences with that they can prevent you from
cities.
selling in a lot of cases where it wasn't intended to be sold.
City codes versus the
Yeah.
state code. Any more questions?
You definitely want to follow the laws if you're out there selling your honey, because eventually you're going to run across somebody that's going to get very picky. Any other questions?
I don't see any other questions.
No. As far as this month, that was good, John. Appreciate it. And y'all say we got Lance Wilson next month.
Lance is set up for next month he's going to do his Mite spiel again about organic versus chemical and some of the IPM methods and stuff. So I've already talked to him, so he's lined up, ready to go for August.
And I guarantee you, if he's committed, unless an emergency comes up, he won't back out on us. So that'll be good. So, okay. Well, y'all have anything else?
People looking for the extraction, we still have some open slots in our extraction schedule. If you'll email john@sabineCreekHoney.com or beekeeper1959@gmail, we can get a schedule out to you so you can get on that if you're looking for a place to do some extracting. Save yourself some money. Mark Robertson asked, did we start our extraction? Yes, we're doing ours this week.
The honey tastes really good though, very fine flavor, and
It's a little light in some of the aspects as far as the weights, but I hadn't gotten to my deep shit.
All right. Well, I guess this will conclude our meeting, and I know we'll meet this way again next month for sure, and for the foreseeable futures. So I appreciate y'all doing that tonight. And Blake, if you're still there, thank you. So we will be talking to everyone next month. If y'all have any more questions, just send them on in and we'll see what we can do for you.
All right, appreciate it.
All right. Talk to you later.